The city woke before the sun, restless and half alive, a creature made of steel and screens. Its heart pulsed through traffic lights and subway tunnels, through the footsteps of people who moved fast but saw nothing. Ryan was one of them. Every morning he walked the same street, past the same faces, heard the same sounds that no longer reached him. He existed in motion, always half distracted, eyes on the next task, the next hour, the next message. The world around him was loud, yet strangely silent. In his office tower, glass reflected more glass, endless copies of the same sky. People talked without listening, smiled without meaning, and worked without feeling. Ryan did the same, believing that was life. He filled his days with noise, notifications, meetings, music that drowned the quiet between thoughts. The city rewarded distraction. It made stillness feel like failure. But something inside him had begun to stir, a faint discomfort that followed him everywhere, a sense that he was living on the surface of things. One rainy afternoon, he stopped at the cafe he visited every morning without noticing. It was crowded and warm, the smell of coffee thick in the air. He sat near the window, scrolling through messages, his attention moving nowhere. Then, through the blur of routine, his eyes caught something. A young woman at the counter, her voice light, her smile steady, her hands trembling slightly as she held a notebook against her chest. There was nothing unusual about her, yet something in the way she stood pulled his attention. Her eyes, calm but distant, carried a quiet heaviness that her expression tried to hide. She looked like someone playing a part she no longer believed in. Ryan watched as she spoke to the barista. Her lips moved with practiced charm, but her posture told another story. When no one looked, her shoulders fell, her smile faded, her gaze dropped to the floor. It was so brief most people would have missed it, but Ryan saw it. The mask slipping, the truth flickering beneath it. He felt a strange stillness, as if the noise of the cafe had dimmed for a moment. He realized that every day he had seen hundreds of faces, heard thousands of voices, and never once looked beyond the surface. Now he couldn't look away. The woman took her drink and sat by the window, near the reflection of rain against glass. Her fingers traced slow circles on the cup, her eyes unfocused, her body perfectly still, while the world moved around her. Outside, the streets shimmered under the drizzle, people rushing past with umbrellas tilted against the wind. She watched them with quiet detachment, and in her stillness, Ryan recognized something familiar, a hidden sadness, a fatigue disguised as calm. It was the same weight he carried, but never named. When she left, he remained by the window, staring at the spot she had been. The city outside was unchanged, yet everything seemed different. The faces that passed were no longer anonymous. They were stories, each carrying a silence of its own. He saw tension behind smiles, distraction behind laughter, loneliness behind movement. The realization unsettled him. For years he had looked without seeing, listened without hearing. Now his mind refused to return to blindness. That evening, as he walked home, the streets looked sharper, the air heavier. Neon signs glowed against puddles, bending light into strange shapes. Ryan felt as though he had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The world had not changed, but his eyes had. Beneath the city's noise, beneath its rhythm and speed, there was a quiet truth running like an underground river, and for the first time, he could feel it moving.
The next morning, the world felt distant, as if wrapped in glass. Ryan moved through the same routine, yet something invisible had shifted. The noise that once filled his head now echoed hollow. Every sound seemed sharper, every silence deeper. The city's chaos continued, but within him there was a new kind of quiet, a quiet that watched instead of rushed. He no longer felt part of the crowd. He was moving among them, but not with them. The stillness that had begun the day before followed him like a shadow he could not shake. At work, the rhythm was unchanged. Phones rang, voices overlapped, the hum of conversation filled the air. Yet, to Ryan, it all sounded artificial. He began noticing how people spoke only to be heard, not understood. Words layered over each other like walls, not bridges. His manager's cheerful tone hid a restlessness in the tapping of his pen. The assistant, who always smiled, had red eyes from sleeplessness. A colleague's constant jokes grew louder when silence lingered too long. Every gesture, every pause carried meaning that words tried to bury. The office was full of noise, but underneath it, Ryan could hear the language of tension. He found himself drawn to silence, not the absence of sound, but the stillness between moments. In the elevator, he noticed the uncomfortable shifting of feet, the nervous glances at screens, the shallow breathing that filled the small space. During lunch, he sat near the window while others gathered in groups. Their conversations rose and fell like waves, but he no longer needed to join them. He was learning to listen differently, to tone, to rhythm, to everything unsaid. The more he listened, the more he realized how much of human life was built around avoiding silence. People feared it because silence revealed too much. Later that day, he stopped at the park on his way home. Children ran in circles, parents scrolled on their phones, dogs barked at one another. Amid the motion, an old man sat feeding pigeons, his hands slow and patient. The world seemed to bend around his stillness. Ryan stood watching, feeling a pull toward that calm. The man did not look around or speak to anyone. He simply existed, and that simplicity felt like strength. It was then Ryan understood that silence was not emptiness, it was presence. It was awareness sharpened to a blade. As dusk approached, the city softened. Traffic lights glowed against the fading sky, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the narrow streets. Ryan walked without rushing, letting the world move around him. He saw details he had never seen before. A woman pausing to adjust her scarf with a trembling hand. a street musician playing a melody no one listened to, a child watching raindrops slide down a window with perfect focus. These small moments, ordinary yet alive, felt heavier than all the noise of the day. They were pure, untouched by pretense. That night, Ryan sat by his window, the city lights flickering across his face. He could hear laughter from the street, the hum of a distant engine, the faint rhythm of someone's television through the wall. Yet beneath it all lay something vast and wordless. For the first time, he didn't try to fill the silence. He let it fill him. His thoughts slowed, his breathing deepened, and the space between sounds became his refuge. The noise of the world had not vanished, but now he could hear what lived beneath it. The quiet truth of existence, the stillness that had been waiting all along.
Weeks passed, and Ryan's life began to unfold in a slower rhythm. He no longer chased the hours, he watched them. The city that once overwhelmed him had become his classroom, its people his silent teachers. He started to see patterns in behavior that others overlooked, the subtle choreography of human nature. Every gesture, every pause, every flicker of emotion seemed to hold a lesson. Without realizing it, he had entered what he called his invisible school, a place with no walls and no teachers, only endless observation. Each morning on the train, he sat quietly, notebook in hand. The crowd around him was predictable, yet each face told a new story. A man in a great coat stared at his reflection, straightening his tie twice before every stop, as though preparing for judgment. A woman read the same page of her book for 5 minutes, her eyes not moving, her mind clearly elsewhere. A teenager with headphones nodded to music too fast for his still body, as if holding tension beneath rhythm. Ryan wrote small notes on the edge of a page. Fear of impression, distraction, hidden energy. He realized that most people didn't live their emotions. They managed them, disguised them, polished them until no one could see what was real. At work, his observation deepened. He no longer measured conversations by what was said, but by what was avoided. The project manager, always composed, spoke with her hands pressed tightly together under the table, a quiet sign of self-control. Another colleague, the loudest in the room, laughed before every sentence, using humor as armor. The intern, too quiet for attention, carried a restlessness in her posture, her shoulders slightly raised, her foot tapping an invisible beat. The room was full of signals, an orchestra of unspoken feelings. Ryan understood that people's true language was not verbal, but physical. Their bodies confessed what their mouths denied. In the evenings, he walked through the streets and practiced awareness. He would pick a spot in a cafe or a park and simply watch. Two friends sitting across from each other smiled constantly, but their eyes never met. A young man on his phone pretended to laugh at a message, his expression freezing as soon as he lowered the screen. A couple at a table argued in silence, their words replaced by the shifting of cups and folded arms. Every moment seemed to carry a secret, and the more he observed, the more he became fluent in this unspoken language. Yet the invisible school did not teach superiority. It taught humility. The more Ryan saw, the more he realized how much he had missed before. He began to understand that people were not hiding because they wanted to deceive. They were protecting themselves from a world that demanded perfection. Masks were not always lies. They were shields. Observation was not about judgment, but empathy, seeing others without expectation. He began to apply this awareness inward. In the quiet of his apartment, he noticed his own patterns, the way his jaw tightened during uncertainty, how his hands sought distraction when he felt vulnerable, how his breath quickened when emotions stirred. He wrote these details down beside his observations of others. The notebook became a mirror, each line a reflection of himself. He saw that the human mind, in its fear of pain, built rituals to survive. His had built noise. Now, stripped of it, he was learning to listen not just to people, but to his own silence.
Sometimes the weight of awareness was heavy. Seeing too deeply could feel like carrying invisible light, beautiful but tiring. Still, he couldn't stop. His mind had changed shape, tuned to truth. Late at night, when the city dimmed and the hum of life softened, Ryan would reread his notes by the window. There were no grand conclusions, no judgments, only fragments of understanding. He realized that knowledge of others was not about control but compassion, not about exposure but connection. The invisible school had no graduation, no reward, only continuous sight. But to him, that sight was everything.
At first, Ryan believed that seeing clearly would make life simpler, but the opposite became true. The more he understood people, the more complex they appeared. Every truth revealed another layer, and beneath each layer there was always another mask. The office, once a blur of routine, had turned into a quiet theater. He no longer saw co-workers but performers, each playing a role built for survival. The loud spoke to hide fear, the calm to hide doubt, the confident to hide exhaustion. Everyone had learned how to pretend. And now that Ryan could see through the act, he couldn't stop watching it unfold. One morning, a meeting filled the conference room with false brightness. Voices overlapped with laughter that came too fast, gestures too wide. The manager spoke about success, yet his hand trembled as he adjusted his notes. A designer praised every idea with exaggerated enthusiasm, though her eyes darted toward the clock. Across the table, a quiet man agreed with everything, nodding at every sentence, his leg moving restlessly under the desk. Ryan noticed that no one truly listened. Every person was performing for approval, playing their small part in a dance of control. It was not dishonesty, but fear of transparency, the kind that made people build walls behind smiles. Outside the office, the performance continued. At a cafe one afternoon, Ryan sat near the window as rain blurred the glass. The couple at the next table looked perfect to anyone watching from afar. Their posture elegant, their hands touching, their smiles constant. But their silence was sharp. Between them, tension pulsed like electricity. She laughed without looking at him. He nodded without hearing her. The mask of harmony was flawless, yet fragile, cracking in every pause. Ryan watched and wondered how many lives were built on the edge of such illusions, where truth was too dangerous to show. In the subway, he saw another kind of mask, the weary one.
A businessman in an expensive suit sat with his eyes closed, his face calm, but his fingers twitching against his knee. A young woman scrolled through her phone, posting cheerful fragments of a life that didn't exist. A mother spoke softly to her child, yet her shoulders sagged with quiet fatigue. The train was full of people pretending to be fine, pretending not to notice each other's pain. The air was thick with invisible effort. Everyone wore a version of peace that cost them too much to maintain. At night, Ryan found himself studying his own reflection in the mirror. The face looking back seemed both familiar and foreign. The calm he carried, the silence he practiced, had become its own disguise. He had traded the mask of busyness for the mask of detachment. Behind his composed expression, he could feel the same fear that filled the people he observed, the fear of being exposed, misunderstood, too human. He realized that understanding others had not freed him from his own performance. It had only refined it. Awareness, if left unchecked, could become another mask, one made of control. He began to look for moments when masks slipped. They were brief, fragile, but honest. The friend whose confident voice cracked when mentioning the future. The coworker who stared too long at her empty coffee cup after sharing a joke. The stranger on the street who paused to adjust his sleeve, hiding a shaking hand. These were the seconds when truth escaped before the mask could return. They were small, almost invisible, yet Ryan found beauty in them. They reminded him that beneath every performance lived something real: fear, longing, love, the need to be seen. He learned that masks were not lies, but languages. People wore them to navigate the fragile terrain of expectation. Some masks were shields against pain, others armor against judgment. Even his silence, once a tool for understanding, had become protection from the chaos he could no longer unsee. It slowly stopped fighting the existence of masks. He began to accept them as part of the human condition, not symbols of deception, but of fragility. One evening, while walking home through the crowded streets, Ryan noticed
how the glow of shop windows turned faces into silhouettes. Every person passing him was half shadow, half light. He thought about how every human carried both, the truth they feared to reveal and the mask they used to survive. And for the first time, instead of feeling detached from it all, he felt connected. The masks did not separate people. They proved they shared the same vulnerability. Beneath the layers of pretending, everyone was trying to be safe in a world that rarely was. The knowledge softened him. He no longer looked to expose anyone. He looked to understand them, to meet them halfway between illusion and truth. And that, he realized, was the only way to see without judgment.
The noise of the city had always been the background to Ryan's life, but now it began to feel unbearable. Every sound carried weight: horns, footsteps, fragments of conversation, even the hum of electricity in the air. He could see what people felt, sense what they hid, and yet it was too much. The more he noticed, the more distant he became from the rhythm of the world. His awareness, once a gift, had started to feel like a cage. He longed for a moment without meaning, a moment untouched by observation. One morning, without deciding, he packed a small bag, left his phone behind, and took a train toward the coast. He needed distance from everything human, even from himself. When he reached the sea, the wind was cold and sharp. The waves moved with a rhythm that required no audience. The sound of them, endless, ancient, cut through the noise that had filled his mind for months. He walked for hours along the shore, sand sticking to his shoes, the horizon swallowing the light. There were no voices, no movement, except the sea itself. He sat near the water and watched. The world around him breathed in slow motion. Time dissolved. The silence that surrounded him was not empty. It was alive, dense with presence. At first, his thoughts rebelled. They demanded sound, demanded interpretation. They repeated everything he had seen and understood: faces, gestures, truths, lies, all the invisible language of humanity. But the longer he stayed still, the quieter his mind became. The wind replaced his thoughts. The sound of the waves matched his heartbeat, and the sky opened above him with a clarity that words could not describe. He realized that he had spent his life trying to understand the world through observation, through constant analysis. But understanding did not equal peace. Peace began only when observation ended. As dusk came, Ryan watched a gull hover above the water, dive, miss its target, and rise again. The bird did not hesitate or question its failure. It simply continued. That single movement felt like a lesson. To live was not to decode meaning from everything. It was to flow with the moment, to fail and rise without asking why. For the first time, Ryan understood that his endless search for truth had been a form of resistance, a way to protect himself from the chaos of simply existing. In trying to see everything, he had forgotten how to be part of it. The night air grew colder, but he didn't move. The sound of the ocean surrounded him, vast and steady. The city's rhythm was gone, replaced by something deeper. The rhythm of nature, the pulse that didn't need control. His breathing slowed until it matched the sea's eternal motion. He watched the moon rise, its reflection trembling across the water, breaking and reforming with each wave. It was a reminder that silence was not stillness. It was motion without noise, change without effort. In the distance, a lighthouse blinked at steady intervals, cutting through the dark like a heartbeat. Ryan stared at it for a long time, its light fading and returning again and again. That pulse, patient and sure, felt like the center of everything. He realized that silence was not about escape, it was about alignment. To be silent was to find the point where the external and the internal became one continuous flow. The stillness he sought was not absence, it was connection, without interference. Hours passed, though he did not count them. The tide rose, touched his shoes, and retreated again. His body felt weightless, his mind no longer racing to interpret. The questions that had haunted him about truth, about masks, about meaning, seemed irrelevant here. The ocean did not explain itself, and yet it made sense in every movement. He understood that life did not need to be solved, it needed to be lived with awareness, not analysis. When dawn finally broke, the light was soft and clean. The first seagulls called above the waves, their cries sharp but pure. Ryan stood slowly, his body cold but light. Something had shifted inside him, not clarity, not revelation, but a quiet balance. He looked at the horizon, at the line where the sea met the sky, and knew he had found what he came for. The point of silence was not a place, it was a state of being, a moment where the need to see ended and the ability to feel began. The world would be loud again, the city impatient and restless, but now he carried something unshakable within him. The silence had become part of him, an invisible center he could return to no matter where he was.
When Ryan returned to the city, it no longer felt like the same place. The tall buildings still shimmered with light, the streets still pulsed with motion, and the people still moved as they always had, yet everything seemed stripped of its illusion. The silence he had found by the sea followed him back like an invisible thread. It stretched between him and the noise, not separating him from it, but softening its edges. For the first time, he walked through the crowd and did not feel overwhelmed. He no longer tried to read faces or decode meaning. He simply saw things as they were. The city had not changed, but he had lost the filter that once distorted his vision. On his first morning back, he stood in line at the cafe he used to visit. The same workers moved with mechanical speed, their words practiced and precise. Yet Ryan could see beyond the rhythm of repetition. The tiredness in their shoulders, the faint hope in their smiles, the quiet endurance that carried them through the day. The girl who handed him his coffee looked at him briefly, and for a moment he saw her clearly, not as a stranger, but as another soul existing in the same vast silence. There was no judgment, no analysis, only understanding. At work, everything resumed as before. Meetings filled the hours, people spoke in circles, tension wove through every discussion. But Ryan no longer absorbed it. He moved through the day with calm focus, responding when needed, silent when not. His coworkers began to notice the shift. They mistook his composure for confidence, unaware it came from something simpler: acceptance.
He had stopped trying to fix or interpret everything. The world was no longer a puzzle to solve. It was a landscape to walk through with awareness. In the evenings, he wandered through the city streets and let the world reveal itself. He saw how beauty and pain lived side by side without contradiction. The woman crying quietly in a taxi while a couple laughed on the corner. The homeless man feeding pigeons with the same tenderness a parent might give a child. The flickering light of an apartment window where someone practiced piano far past midnight. There was no separation between tragedy and peace. Both were parts of the same truth. The more he saw, the less he felt the need to name what he saw. Existence spoke its own language now, one beyond words. The silence within him grew stronger, not as emptiness, but as space. When people spoke, he listened without waiting for his turn. When someone grew angry, he felt no impulse to defend. His quietness became contagious. In meetings, arguments faded faster, decisions came more naturally. Friends sought his company without knowing why. They said he made things feel lighter. Ryan didn't offer advice, he offered presence, and somehow that was enough. The silence he carried was not withdrawal, but connection.
One afternoon, he sat in the park watching sunlight fall through the trees. Children ran in circles, their laughter filling the air. A man sat on a bench eating his lunch, his face tilted toward the sky as if remembering something beautiful. The wind moved through the leaves in a rhythm too subtle for sound. In that moment, Ryan realized that everything he had once searched for, truth, clarity, understanding, had always been hidden beneath layers of noise. The world had never been blind. It was his perception that had been clouded. Seeing without filters meant seeing without control, and in that surrender, he found freedom. The days began to move effortlessly, not because they were easier, but because they no longer needed to be different. Ryan still noticed pain and confusion in people, but he no longer felt the urge to fix them. Compassion replaced curiosity. Awareness replaced analysis. Life became transparent, simple, and astonishingly alive. The smallest moments carried depth. The warmth of a cup in his hands, the echo of footsteps on wet pavement, the quiet hum of the city before dawn. These were no longer background details. They were the essence of living. At night, he would stand by his window watching the lights flicker across the skyline. The city no longer looked like a place of chaos, but of motion and rhythm. Each light a heartbeat, each sound part of a greater harmony. He thought about how long he had spent chasing understanding, believing clarity was something to earn. Yet now he saw that clarity came only when the need to control disappeared. The world did not need to be filtered or explained. It only needed to be witnessed. In the stillness of that realization, Ryan understood that the observer and the observed were never separate. To see clearly was to belong completely. The silence within him was not a refuge from the world, but a bridge into it. Everything he had once feared losing, connection, purpose, meaning, had been waiting behind the noise all along. The world was not hiding. It was revealing itself every second to anyone willing to be still enough to see. And so he lived quietly, not detached, but awake. The city moved, the people changed, the days came and went, yet each moment carried the same truth. The unfiltered world was not something to be found, but something to return to. It had always been there, beneath thought, beneath noise, beneath fear. In that awareness, Ryan found his peace, not in escaping life, but in seeing it completely, just as it was, and knowing that nothing more was needed.
Thanks! Please subscribe and like. Spin a new yarn with us every week. See you there!